What is up, folks? Welcome back to Peaceful Coding Tutorials, and today we're going to look at how we can code MS Paint right here in our browser. So let's go ahead and jump right into it, and we'll start off as normal with just kind of creating our three files in which we'll write our web application. So we'll make our HTML file, we'll make our JavaScript file, and we'll make our CSS file. And as per usual, we're just going to go ahead and import the JavaScript into the HTML file, and we'll also import the CSS into our HTML file as well. Perfect. So from here, let's go ahead and just start coding. Actually, and the question is, what do we want to start coding? So let's kind of envision what this is actually going to look like first. And what I'm thinking is we'll create a canvas on which a grid of pixels exist, and as the user drags their mouse across these pixels, we'll color them according to maybe what their brush color is or something like that. And we'll see how far we want to get into this example. But what we can do to start out is let's just go ahead and make the container for our canvas. We can call this thing let's call it container. That's what I usually like to call my main div in which I put everything. And from here, let's go ahead and enter the JavaScript and fill this thing with a whole bunch of pixels. And so we'll go ahead and we'll select that element that we just made. We'll call it container document dot query selector, and we'll select it by its class container. I think we gave that a class. Yes, we did. All right, perfect. From here, let's go ahead and add all of the pixels to the container. So let's add some comments this time. Sometimes we have not been very good about adding comments, but we'll say add pixels to container. And so we'll go ahead and we need to decide how many pixels we want. So we'll say, canvas size is equal to, let's say we have a 100 by 100 canvas. And so we'll say, okay, for I is less than size, I++, so 100 times, let's add a row of pixels to the container. So we'll say create a row. Row is document dot create element. Create element. Great, so we'll create a row in which we'll put our pixels, and we'll add this row to the container. So container dot append child row. And now we just need to add pixels to this row. And so let's go ahead and do that, and we'll once again loop through our size. So we'll say do the following size times, j is equal to 0, j is less than size, j++, and we're just using j here to prevent a conflict with I on line 4. And we'll say go ahead and add a pixel. So pixel is document dot create element, so we're creating new elements that we put on the page here. And we'll add this pixel to our row, row.append child pixel. Okay, great. So at this point, if we were to just look at this HTML file, I'll go ahead and open this up in Live Server. We should see that if we inspect the page and look at the structure of our HTML, we have a whole bunch of divs. And so these are our rows, and inside each row, you can see we have a bunch of pixels, and they don't look like anything yet. And so let's go ahead and add some styles to these pixels. And over in our CSS, we'll say that we'll create some selector that selects those pixels. There's a variety of ways to do this. This is kind of a simple way where we just say, look for an element with the class container and look for an immediate div child of that container element. And then from there, look for an immediate div child of that div that was in that container. So this is selecting each pixel individually. And we'll say that these things are going to have a width of, we could say 1 pixel. I think that would make sense. So we'll say they have a width of 1 pixel and a height of 1 pixel. And I think that's it. We also might want to give our container some kind of border or something like that so that we can actually see what the container looks like. And we are not actually seeing anything yet. I was kind of expecting that we would in fact see something now that we gave our container a black outline, but it looks like it is not actually getting that style, which we can tell by looking at the style pane here. So let's debug. Oh, I misspelled container. And there we go, we've got our black border. Okay, cool. The other thing, oh, interesting, this is much much taller than it is wide, but we made a square, so something is going wrong here. Oh, and you know what? It's probably because our pixels are all rendering one on top of another. So if we were to actually give these a temporary border or something like that, border 1 pixel solid red, we can actually see these things on the page. And we can see, okay, this is not quite what we want. They are all lined up on the left side. And so let's actually tell our rows that the children elements of each row should display as a row instead of a column like they are currently. And so we'll add one more selector here, one more style rule that says select each row, which is going to be the immediate div child of the container, and give them the display flex property, which by default will make things display as a row instead of a column. Okay, great. One thing that's a little strange here is we can see that our container with the black outline is actually wider than our pixels here. And the reason for that is by default, an element in HTML will just take up the entire width that it has available to it. And we can mess around with the CSS briefly to see if we can fix this. There's way too many ways to do everything in CSS, but usually I like to just experiment in this panel and see kind of what works based on some of the style rules that I know off the top of my head. And so here's kind of an old school way that we can tell this element that it should not take up the entire width of the screen, and that's by giving it the display inline block property. Keep in mind that if we do edit anything in the style pane, when we refresh, that those changes are reverted. So we actually have to make those changes over here in our code. And so we'll just say that for the container, give this display inline block property. Cool. All right, looks great. Let's also remove the border from our pixels. And so we'll remove that. And we can see this actually got substantially smaller because that border was actually adding size to each of our pixels. So let's actually add maybe 3 times more pixels or so, and we'll come back to our JavaScript and just make that change in our size variable. And this seems like a decent size for us to work with for our canvas. Okay, so from here, let's just assume that the user has the brush tool in their hand. If we were to expand this program that we're making, we could add all kinds of tools that do different pieces of functionality, but let's just start by giving them the brush tool. And so when they click down and drag their mouse, we should see that some pixels change their color. Okay, great. So we will say, let's add add event listeners to handle the user drawing on the canvas. So handle drawing. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to say, listen for if the user has clicked down or clicked up. So we're going to need some variable to store whether the user's mouse is clicked or not. And then from there, we'll need to say, as they move around, if the mouse is clicked and they drag their mouse over these elements, these pixel elements, go ahead and change their value. Okay, cool. So let's just try to do that, and we'll start off by creating some variable that's going to hold the piece of state that indicates whether or not the user has their mouse clicked down. So we can say, is mouse clicked down? We could also probably just say, is mouse clicked, but this should work. And we'll want to add some kind of listener that listens for whether they've clicked or unclicked their mouse. And we can do that by adding an event listener right on the document, kind of the main element of our page. And we'll say, okay, we'll use this built-in mouse down event to detect if they have clicked their mouse down. And so if they do click their mouse down, we'll change this variable to true. And if they unclick their mouse down, and so they trigger the mouse up event, then we'll want to set this variable to false. One thing that I always find strange is that this is not in camel case with a capitalized D here. It's just all lowercase, but that's how it is. That's how they decided to do it. And so that is how we have to do it as well. Okay, great. So from here, let's go ahead and write some code that says as we move our mouse around on the page, we will then check if the mouse is clicked down, and if it is, we will change the color of the things we're drawing over. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to add another event listener to say that, okay, when the mouse is moved, go ahead and do something. And what we'll want to do is, like we said, we'll want to check if the mouse is clicked down. And if it is, we'll want to get the pixels that are near the mouse and change their color. So I think the big question here is, how are we going to get the pixels that are near the mouse? There's a lot of ways we could go about this. And I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but I'm sure we'll get there. I'm thinking one way to do it is we write our code in some way that allows us to look at the coordinates of the mouse on the page, and then based on those coordinates, we're able to fetch the pixels that are near that. That might be the way that we have to do this. Another way is we could add event listeners to the pixels themselves. So as we drag the mouse over them, we're changing their color. I think the issue there, though, would be that we wouldn't be able to know if a pixel is near the mouse's position. So I think we have to roll with that first option, where we use logic to look at the position of the mouse and update the pixels accordingly. So that's probably going to be sufficient logic that we'll want to use a helper function just to keep ourselves organized. And so what we might say is, we might say, okay, we're going to create some function that'll give us the pixel elements which are near the mouse. And the other question is, how do we get the mouse position? And it turns out that each of these event listeners, this function that we pass to them, allows us to access the mouse move event, or if we did it up here, it would be the mouse up event or the mouse down event. But in this case, it would be the mouse move event. And this mouse move event should have some information that tells us what kind of where the mouse is. But anyways, back to what I was saying, we're going to make some helper function that will give us the pixels near the mouse. And so we'll say get pixels near mouse. And this will probably need to take in the mouse's coordinates, and we'll determine how to get those in just a second. But let's write this function first. This will go down here somewhere. And we know that this will need to at least take in the X and Y position of the mouse on the page. Okay, great. So the question is, how do we get those mouse X and mouse Y variables out of this event? I'm not sure, but let's look at this event object in the browser. And so in order to trigger this section of code, we'll need to move our mouse around, and we'll need to make sure that we've clicked the mouse down. Okay, great. So let's try that. So moving the mouse around, nothing's happening, but if I click and I move, then we get all these mouse events printing out. And we've got a bunch of different properties on these, including screen X and screen Y, which look promising. And we've also got client X and client Y. Off the top of my head, I think client X, and then we've also just got X and Y. It looks like X and Y, page X, page Y, those are the same. Layer X, layer Y, those are the same. Client X, client Y, those are the same. So let's just assume that this is what we need. We also could Google it, but I'm feeling lucky on this one. And so we'll just say event.x and event.y are what we're going to pass in to get pixels near mouse. And let's just verify that we are in fact getting those arguments passed through. And yes, that does look good. We're seeing we have lots of print statements happening there, or log statements. Okay, so we'll come back to this function, but let's just carry out whatever we want to do here before we get lost in the sauce of this function, which I think will be the most difficult part of this example we're looking at. And once we have the pixels, and we'll assume that these are HTML elements, these pixels, we'll want to loop through them and say, for each of these pixels, we could also do, there's a bunch of ways we could loop. Let's just do for const pixel of pixels. And we will go ahead and change the style of this. So we'll say style.background color is equal to whatever color the user has in their brush, and we'll just say that that is red. You could also put a hex code in here. Alternatively, that should work just fine. Okay, so I think it is time to get into this function now, get pixels near mouse. And we know the mouse X and mouse Y, and now the big question is, how do we get the pixels that are near the mouse? And I think what we'll need to do is we'll need to iterate through every pixel, and we'll need to know what that pixel's x and y coordinate is. And then from there, we can use the distance formula to say if the distance between the x and y position of the pixel is and the mouse is less than some threshold, then it is near the mouse, and we will go ahead and return it or add it to some list of pixels that will then return from this function. So let's go ahead and just start off by creating this empty array in which we'll put the pixels, and then let's try to loop through all of our pixels. And how do we do that? We're going to need to, well, we're going to need to have a matrix of all of our pixels. And so maybe what we do here is, while we're creating these pixels, we could add them to a matrix structure. And so then one thing we're gonna have to watch out for is these variable names being the same. So let's call this pixels near mouse. And we'll do the same here just to prevent confusion. Pixels near mouse, we'll call this pixel near mouse. This one actually I think would be okay if we didn't change it, but that's fine. And then this is all of the pixels. And so we'll say, okay, so every time we add a row, we are also going to make an array of pixels, call this pixels array. And then every time we make a pixel, we'll put it in this pixels array. So pixels array, maybe we could call that row or something. It's a little confusing with these variable names. Sometimes I like to call my HTML elements container element to prevent confusion with the other non-HTML element variables that I have floating around. But let's just roll with these names for now. Pixels array.push pixel, and then down here we'll say pixels.push pixel array. And so what we've done here is we've created a 2D array or a matrix of our pixel elements. And let's actually just take a look at what that looks like. So console.log pixels, and you can see, okay, we've got this array, and in it we have all these other arrays. So each element in our outer array is an array itself, and the children of that array are all divs. And you can see just barely on the screen that as we highlight over these divs, each one represents a different pixel in our box. Okay, great. So one question is, which pixels have which coordinates? And that is a great question. There is probably a way that we could call some method on this HTML element to determine what its location is, or we could just use the fact that each one of these is 1 pixel in size and go from there. And I think the other question we need to answer is the top left 0, 0? Or is it, the height of the screen, comma 0? Or, what's our frame of reference for what's what here? Okay, and I tried to kind of drag around my mouse to see, okay, how does that mouse X and mouse Y change as we move around? And it looks like I created some kind of error, so let's actually investigate that real quick. Apparently pixels near mouse is not defined. On line 28, right here, pixels near mouse, pixel near mouse, pixels near mouse. This it may be because we're returning nothing from this function right now. So let's just add a placeholder return statement to this so that this is just returning that empty array. And okay, we got rid of our console.log that indicates what the position of the mouse is, but let's just add that back real quick so that we can look at how these coordinates change as we move our mouse around the screen. Okay, there we go. So as we move to the top left, okay, we can see that the top left is actually 0, 0. And then as we move down, the Y increases, and as we move to the right, the X increases. And then, of course, we have our maximum X and maximum Y at the bottom right corner. So that is pretty convenient because that's actually kind of the same way that our pixels are laid out. We first added this first row, and then within that, we added left to right pixels in it, and then we continued down into the right from there. So that is going to be pretty convenient. One thing we'll also need to do is we either will need to account for this margin in between the container and the edge of the screen, which we could either measure and account for, or we could just get rid of by adding a style rule to the body of our document to get rid of that margin. Let's do that. So we'll say in our CSS, body should have margin 0. There is still this 1 pixel border that technically we would need to deal with, but it might be minor enough that we don't really notice it. Okay, great. So from here, let's go ahead and iterate through all of our pixels. And so we'll say, okay, put this back on top. So for I is equal to 0, I is less than the number of rows in our pixel matrix called pixels defined on line 2. So iterate through each of our rows, and then from here also iterate through each of our columns. Great. Okay, so we've got our nested for loop, and this will allow us to look at each row first, and then inside the second for loop, look at each pixel inside of each row. So now we need to determine what the position, the X and Y position of the pixel is, and that should be as simple as I and J here in our loop. Actually, I is going to be Y, weirdly, because that is the row index, and then J will be X because that is the column index. So we'll say, okay, X equals I, and we could even account for that 1 pixel border by either adding or subtracting 1 from this value, but I'm not exactly sure which, so let's just not. So what did I say? X is equal to J and Y is equal to I. And we don't need to rename this variable, but this will just help us kind of keep track of what's going on here. Great, so now let's use the distance formula and say how far is this pixel from the mouse. So we can say distance is equal to math.square root of dx squared plus yx squared. So and so we need to take the difference here. So let's actually store these in their own variables. So we'll say the difference between the mouse x and the pixel x is mouse x minus x. Same thing for y, but using y instead of x. And then in our distance formula, we can do dx squared plus dy squared. Great. Oh, I forgot, where did dy go? Oh, I somehow deleted dy before I started writing this. Okay, good enough. dx squared plus dy squared. Okay, finally we need to say if the distance is less than our brush size, essentially. So let's just define a brush size here. We'll say this has a 5 pixel radius or 10 pixel radius for now. Then let's go ahead and say that this pixel should be colored by the brush. So if distance is less than our brush size, then we'll say, okay, add this pixel to the pixels near mouse array. So we'll push on the current pixel, which we actually have not defined here, but that's going to be the pixel in the pixel matrix, getting the ith row of that pixel matrix, and then the jth pixel inside that row. So pixels indexed at I, indexed at j, and we'll push that onto our pixels near mouse array. Okay, I'll just delete that console log there, and I think we should be good. So if we come in here, look at that, it's looking pretty good. There's a little bit of a funny artifact here, which is that if we move super quick, we only get a mouse move event every so often. So there's kind of a little bit of clipping happening there, but this is looking pretty good. So if we were to continue this example, we could add buttons that let us change that brush size. We could add other buttons that let us change the color here, and maybe we could add an erase tool or something like that. But that is it for this video, so thank you for watching. If you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to add them in the comments, and I hope you have a nice day. Catch you next time.